Hello everyone and welcome to every episode of the Fairly Oddparents Season 5 reviewed. I barely remember any of these, so let's just jump right into the episodes. Episode 60A, Nega-Timmy. Timmy becomes evil after doing the opposite when his dad tells him to be good. Have you ever wondered what small thing could get you to hate an episode? One line of dialogue from this episode is all it took. In this episode, Cosmo spends the whole time telling Wanda how much of a buzzkill she is, and that she takes the fun out of Timmy's wishes by telling them what a bad idea they are. Because of this, Wanda, even after creating a death ray that could destroy Dimmsdale, only barely budges. And that's when Cosmo decides to try to make it Wanda's fault for not trying to unwish this wish sooner, despite essentially being the one that caused the problem. This really is one of Cosmo's worst appearances. I get that he's supposed to be stupid, but not this bad, and certainly not at Wanda's expense. Even when the conflict is resolved, Cosmo keeps blaming the entire conflict on Wanda after it's already been bashed into our heads enough at this point. And if that wasn't bad enough, Timmy's parents are complete morons in this episode. And not funny ones either. In this episode, Timmy's parents are the kind of morons that are blind to the world around them. As in, they don't know their own son is on TV after seeing him with the acid they just gave him. It's a bad episode. And, oh yeah, the cherry on top is that in some forced attempt at a joke, the episode ends with Cosmo basically killing Mr. Crocker. And the joke doesn't even work because Crocker really doesn't even feel any pain, so there's no payoff. Episode 60B, Love at First Height. In order to become tall enough to ride a roller coaster, Timmy wishes for the body of a 16-year-old, as Vicky falls in love with this new version. I can only see this episode as wasted potential. At first, it looks like Timmy's gonna join Chester and AJ in Adultland, and that would have made for a pretty interesting episode, especially if it would have been about something we hadn't seen before. Instead, we got a rehashed version of a couple of other episodes. On top of this creepy age gap that I don't even want to think about. Seriously, I never thought I'd see Vicky stoop down to borderline pedophilia. Like, if I have to look up mind-body dualism and read an entire Wikipedia article about one of the deepest unanswered questions in philosophy, your plot is too creepy. Does the episode want me to see Timmy's mind or body as the real him? Because they kinda try to say both at the same time, and also neither at the same time. Complicating this is that everyone assumes that Timmy is a Norwegian supermodel, which makes me wonder, who is Timmy supposed to be in this episode? The episode doesn't really seem to know, which means that I don't really know. Now, I do think the jokes that resulted from the whole gah thing were actually pretty funny, but the rest of the episode that comes with it is rough. Especially when you realize that this episode kind of retreads territory the show has already been through. This episode is just similar enough to Beach Bum to raise an eyebrow, and the setting of the episode is the exact same as that old black magic from Season 2. I got a few laughs out of this episode, but at what cost? The rest of the episode that comes with it is almost not even worth it. I'm giving it an okay, but it was dangerously close to being bad. Episode 61A, Yoo Doo. Timmy uses a Yoo Doo doll to get back at Francis for beating him up. For how this episode starts, I was expecting it to be awful. But as the story goes on, it actually starts to justify the awful beginning. The episode starts with Timmy getting beaten to a pulp in various ways. They try to do this as a series of visual gags that I guess were mildly funny, but the rest of the episode does a really good job at justifying the setup. Timmy actually makes the progression from being frustrated by his circumstances to taking the wish too far by harming other people. That second part is something we don't see often enough when the episode tries to make Timmy the bad guy. As a result, this episode feels a lot more complete than other episodes of the show that tried to do this and failed. In fact, Timmy almost dies at the end of the episode, making the stakes a lot higher than they would be in the average Fairly Oddparents episode. I'm gonna give it a good. I really like the story here, and while the jokes were a bit dry, such as the running gag where the Yoo Doo dolls keep getting thrown, I do think this is an episode I'd rewatch again for the story and character dynamics. I really do see this as an improvement to some of the more dry stories we got in Season 4, and I think that should be celebrated. If I have a major gripe with the rest of the episode, it would be the rulebook at the beginning. Why wouldn't these things just be against the rules if they were that bad? It seems like if Timmy wished for one of them in any other episode, they would be against the rules, but it's not in this episode for plot convenience, I guess. But that really doesn't take away from the rest of the episode. Episode 61B, Just Desserts. Timmy wishes for desserts to be the only food for every meal. This episode falls into a category I'd like to call so stupid it's funny. Like, if you can get past the stupidity of the writers not knowing how gravity works, the episode is actually really funny. I'm gonna go ahead and say that it's the funniest of Season 5 so far, and definitely funnier than anything that came out of Season 4. Seeing everyone get so fat that they have to roll around everywhere is so surreal. I was laughing throughout most scenes at just the designs of every one of these morbidly obese people. But this episode is more than just fat jokes. There are a few visual gags with Cosmo at the end of the episode with the cowboys, and I did like Mark Chang's role in the episode. Having him be the only one that wasn't obese because Yucatanian desserts are the opposite was clever, and it doesn't feel like he was here just because. He serves a purpose in the story, and he has comedic reason to be here as well. There were a few minor problems I had with the story, like the beginning is one of those scenes that are all too common where the writers think that making Timmy's parents morons is automatically funny, and the aforementioned misunderstanding of how gravity works, and also the complete misunderstanding of what a sugar high is, but the jokes do make up for those. And on a more fundamental note, I gotta hand it to him on the premise. This really does seem like something a 10-year-old would wish for that has unintended consequences. Overall, it's a good episode. Episode 62A, Go Young, Westman. Catman becomes a kid and becomes a bad influence on Timmy. It's kind of pleasant to see Catman once again. You know, I always liked him a fair bit more than the Crimson Chin, but I guess that's just me. Anyway, about the episode, I have to say that it has everything I want in an episode, but nothing more than that. First off, the truant officer character is hilarious. The jokes they tell with him are really the only ones that I really laughed at in the episode. But, because of his presence here, I do think the episode is funny enough. I also like the creativity of the story. They go a bit deep into Catman's childhood as a child actor, complete with spoofs of shows like Happy Days and Gilligan's Island. I kinda thought they were level 1 references, but I could easily see someone with different tastes finding them funny. I think it was a good story idea to have Catman as a kid be a bad influence on Timmy, and while I like that they made use of that concept, they didn't take it as far as I would have liked them to. While the idea for the story is good and there were a decent amount of jokes I liked, certain scenes in the episode dragged, like the arcade scene for example, and the ending scene in the treehouse as well. I do think though that there is enough here to give this episode a light good. But honestly, it was very close to getting an okay, and I don't know that I disagree that much if you try to tell me it was okay. Episode 62B, Birthday Wish. Timmy loans Cosmo and Wanda to Tootie for her birthday. By now, I'm sure you all know how I feel about the character of Tootie. In most of her appearances, she's a creep, and I end up feeling more disgusted by her antics than I am amused. But in this episode, they actually give her the sympathy she deserves by playing up the angle of how miserable she is, considering Vicky is her older sister. In this episode, Tootie doesn't make any creepy advances towards Timmy, she doesn't spy on him, and she just wants him to come to her birthday party. And Timmy actually does feel guilty and ends up doing something nice in her time of need. This episode is on another level of getting how character dynamics work, and how you can use them to tell a great story. The episode packs quite a lot into 11 minutes. There's the whole Crocker part of the story which I guess had to happen for there to be some kind of suspense, and overall I didn't feel like Crocker was needlessly shoved into the episode. Every character that's here serves a purpose in the story and builds toward the overall experience. And on top of that, they managed to be funny and heartwarming as well. Hands down, this is not just a good episode, but the best one of Season 5 so far. I'm really impressed at how they managed to pull this off, especially considering it stars one of my least favorite characters in the entire show. Maybe in this case, writing her out of character was actually a good thing. Episode 63A, Blondas Have More Fun. Wanda swaps places with her twin sister. I feel as though this episode could have benefited from a longer runtime, because to me, the pacing is really rushed trying to fit every plot point into 11 minutes. This episode is a classic example of a role reversal episode, which is a common trope used in a lot of shows, and a common trope used in this show to an extent. But the role reversal doesn't even happen until 4 minutes in, meaning there's only 7 minutes of time to establish the characters in their new roles, make them like their new roles, transition them to them disliking the new role, and then have them want to switch back. Each step in this process is half-baked because of how little time it's given to develop. The writer spent so much time trying to establish who Blonda even is, and then they establish things like her show. And to me, it feels like time spent focused on the wrong thing. If you're going to do a role reversal episode and introduce a new character at the same time, it's going to have to be longer than 11 minutes. Because if not, you get a half-baked story. The ending doesn't feel earned at all because none of the plot points that led up to it were given enough time to develop. and all of this could have been saved if the episode were funny. But that's another problem. There are no jokes here at all. Not even bad ones. Just 0 attempts at comedy. Because of this, I have to give the story its proper rating without any jokes to pull it up. It's okay. Episode 63B, 5 Days of F.L.A.R.G. Mark celebrates a traditional Yugobatamian holiday on Earth. This is a really poorly conceived episode. It lives and dies based on deceiving the audience. While that can be a good tactic to use for telling jokes, it's used for crucial plot points in this episode. The entire episode can be boiled down to torturing Timmy for a reason where it just felt like they were world building as they go. Mark has been featured in more and more episodes lately, and to see them completely go off the beaten path and just come up with an idea while putting such little thought into it was disappointing. Everything that happens in this episode happens at Timmy's expense. He gets beaten up, barfed on, and even mentally tortured in this episode beyond anything he reasonably deserves. And the episode thinks this is okay because if this stuff doesn't happen, Earth will be destroyed. But of course, the stupidity couldn't just end there, because in the end, it turns out Earth didn't have to be destroyed thanks to a convenient loophole, and the episode ends with Fairy World being destroyed. All of that would be enough to make this a bad episode. But they went the extra mile and decided to give Mark essentially a happy tone at the thought of the Earth being destroyed again. Like, if you want to play the card that he's Timmy's friend, you can't do that. You can't have Mark try to destroy the planet his best friend lives on with a smile on his face, and play that for laughs. All in all, it's a really flimsy plot at best, with just some serious ethical issues that make this episode really hard to like. Episode 64A, Timmy's 2D House of Horror. Timmy tries to scare Vicky and her family to get them out of his house. In a sea of bland episodes in Season 4, the ones that stood out were the ones that took risks. In a sea of out-there premises in Season 5, the episodes that stick out are often the ones that do one thing and do it really well. In this episode's case, that's no different. This episode plays up the horror angle and uses it to right a wrong I've seen way too much. Timmy actually gets a satisfying ending in this episode after being tortured beyond belief, and it works. And on top of that, we get some really cool visuals. And the premise of the episode is a perfect excuse to marry both of those things in a way that I don't think was ever done before or since. The beginning does start out a little bit dry, but honestly, the ending scene does take a bit of setup. You could say that's a negative, and I don't think I'd really argue with you about that, but it does make sense that the long build-up is proportional to the payoff, and I'm okay with that. The episode gives us a scared Vicky, and that doesn't really happen at all. It's the most satisfying role reversal you'll ever see. From the way I'm talking about this, it's clear that it's a good episode. There's good visuals, good comedy, and a well-thought story. There's not a single dull moment after the 2-minute mark, and even in the beginning there's enough to where I'm not completely bored out of my mind. This is the episode of the season so far with the most rewatch value. Episode 64B, It's a Wishful Life. Timmy does good deeds, and when they go unappreciated, he wishes he was never born. My favorite part of the episode was the Chicago Cubs joke because it's kind of funny how they just assumed, it'll never happen. But in the years since this episode came out, they actually did win the World Series. But I also think it's telling that that's the only funny thing about this episode, and it was something that wasn't even intentional. Because, let's be honest, this episode is just awful. This is perhaps one of the most infamous episodes of the entire show, and for good reason, as the entire concept of the episode is messed up on a whole new level. This is an episode where Timmy wishes that he was never born, and in doing so, sees how everyone's lives were actually better without him. From start to finish, the episode goes to great lengths to crap on Timmy as much as possible. The episode starts with Timmy doing nice things for people only for them to hate them every time, which understandably makes Timmy very angry. Timmy then decides to wish that he was never born, only to see that everyone's life is better without him, even in ways that it's not clear how he could have affected the person's quality of life, such as AJ suddenly having hair. I also have a problem with the dimension that opens up out of a fissure from out of the ground. Jorkin calls it the dimension for kids who improve the world by wishing they were never born. First of all, how are there that many kids that did this that it warrants an entire dimension? And secondly, it's pretty clear that it's just hell. They just wanted a different way of saying that Timmy is going to hell. And considering the fact that Butch Hartman says he puts the gospel in his shows, that sends the implications to a whole new level of being terrible. If it wasn't obvious enough, it's a bad episode. And it contains quite possibly the worst scene in Fairly Oddparents history. As Timmy changes everything back to normal, he's knowingly making everybody's life worse. Don't make an episode about a serious topic if you're not prepared to deal with it. Episode 65A, Escape from Unwish Island. Imaginary Gary kidnaps Timmy's friends and family. I gotta hand it to him. To do a full, all-out continuity-filled episode was really a great idea, especially when it adds to the richness of the world building, unlike a few episodes ago. This time, an episode that introduced a new concept actually thought about how it would make sense and interact with the world as it was already known. And for it to be in such a rich story as well, just adds to the experience when watching this episode. I mean, I was giddy the whole time, and that's not just from references to old episodes. This episode really feels like a celebration of what the Fairly Oddparents has been up to this point, which begs the question, why wasn't this episode 22 minutes long? It seems like as a kid I remember it being a double-length episode, but no, it's not. And for it being an outlandish concept and harkening back to old episodes, you'd expect it to be that way. But I'm glad that they brought back Imaginary Gary anyway, and for him to be the leader of all these unwished wishes is perfect for the characters and the story they're trying to tell. And for these unwished wishes to resent Timmy is also really clever. It's an angle we don't really see in the show, especially considering that wishes tend to be forgotten once they're unwished. It's nice to see that the writers ask the question of where did they go. Overall, I'd consider it a good episode, if for no other reason than the creativity put into it. And so far, as a season, Season 5 does seem to have more creative ideas than Season 4. Episode 65B, The Gland Plan. Cosmo has to have an operation on his F.U.N gland. Thinking about it, this episode is one that couldn't survive if it wasn't funny. It's a Cosmo episode, and Cosmo is a character who carries a lot of the jokes in the show. The bad news of this episode is that it's paced weird. The good news is, it's funny enough to overcome that. Yeah, this is the funniest episode of Season 5 so far. I really like the joke of them disguised as laundry people, and then when Jorgen tries to puncture the laundry bag, it turns out it was really full of laundry. That part wasn't even what made the joke so funny. It's the fact that Anti-Wanda ends up outing them right after that, which is even funnier. A lot of Cosmo's jokes hurting Wanda, a lot of people might find mean-spirited, but I didn't. And I think it's funny because we don't get to see a lot of real pain on Wanda's side. While I did find the jokes to be funny, I do think the episode drags in the first half, and only really picks up in the second half. That's really minor though, and I don't think it holds up this episode that much, especially when there are still a lot of jokes to get you through the slow part of the episode. Because of that, I'm gonna give it a good. And besides saying it was really funny, there's not much more to say. Episode 66A, Back to the Norm. Crocker tries to use Norm to prove the existence of Cosmo and Wanda. You guys remember what I said about the last episode being the funniest one of the season so far? Yeah, well, this one just surpassed it. Norm and Crocker is a really great combination, and it doesn't surprise me to see them use it. The only thing that surprises me is how long it actually took them to use this combination. Norm's jokes about Crocker and how pathetic he thinks Crocker is are really hilarious, and they are used to good effect, especially with how nonchalant Timmy is and how he doesn't really suspect anything of Crocker. Those jokes and just seeing the comedic ways Crocker fails in this episode are really funny. And I think it is a worthy use of Crocker as a character, as sometimes they do play up the pathetic angle of his character, but not nearly enough as I would have liked. And especially not having other characters pointed out like Norm does. And thinking about it, Norm is actually the perfect character to do that, especially since his character is just the cartoon form of his voice actor Norm Macdonald. I also really like the parallel this episode draws to Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote. I think it's nice how they set up that Crocker really will never prove that Timmy has fairy godparents, and how it's just a fruitless goal that ends in him getting hurt. Especially since he has Norm right in front of him, a specimen that can prove the existence of magic. But no, Crocker has to prove the existence of magic at Timmy's expense, and his failure to do so is where the comedy comes in. Overall, it's a good episode. Episode 66B, Teeth for Two. Jorgen tries to get Timmy's baby teeth to propose to the Tooth Fairy. Fun fact, Dr. Bender is not voiced by Gilbert Gottfried in this episode, and I really don't know why. If you were able to get him in the show's first season when it was just getting off the ground, I don't know why you couldn't have him come back in Season 5. But that really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of the episode. I think this episode is another one that's really funny and plays up the comedy as a means of elevating the plot beyond what it could have been without jokes. There's the running gag of Cosmo having a bunch of nicknames for Timmy, which was also my favorite part. There's the running gag of Cosmo having a crush on the Tooth Fairy, and the joke of just how much of a crybaby Jorgen was. I really thought this episode was funny, and it's beginning to be a nice trend to see more episodes with really funny jokes. I also like seeing how this is another fairy-centric episode, which is good. Not every episode has to heavily focus on Timmy, and it's nice to see some of the side characters, especially as The Fairly Oddparents is a show that's known for having really good side characters. I can't really think of a complaint I have about this episode. I'm gonna give it a good. The whole concept is creative, and they use it as a way of telling jokes. Not much else is needed in a Fairly Oddparents episode. Episode 67A, Hassle in the Castle. Timmy sneaks into the castle in Cosmo and Wanda's fishbowl. I think at some point in this review series I've lost my point of reference on what a Fairly Oddparents episode is. And what I mean by that is that I've seen enough of this show to know an episode that was pushed to the side. There's so much potential here. We see Timmy sneaking into Cosmo and Wanda's castle, which already that's a creative idea and, to be honest, an underused idea. A lot of viewers around this time were probably thinking, gee, I wonder what's inside there. And the creativity of the interior design is nothing to be scoffed at either. Seeing all the rooms and what weird things are kept inside them is something very Fairly Oddparents-esque. But that's the exact dilemma I find myself in. I found myself in awe at the visuals of this episode, but at the same time, I didn't really like much else. That leads me to a problem when coming up with a ranking for this episode. I know that I like for there to be jokes in a Fairly Oddparents episode, and to be honest, there aren't a lot here. But I can't let this creativity go unappreciated, especially when I know the Fairly Oddparents staff didn't have to let us in on what's inside the castle in the first place. I'm gonna give this episode a good, but just barely. It was so close to okay, but I had to give the edge to the creativity and the visuals. Episode 67B, Remy Rides Again. Remy tries to make Timmy's life so great he has no need for Cosmo and Wanda. And here we have another episode where I struggle to find an appropriate rating. The beginning of the episode is pretty good, and we have the return of Remy Bucks-a-Plenty, which once again is the return of a really great side character. And they do play up the angle of Remy making Timmy's life basically so perfect he doesn't need Cosmo and Wanda. The problem is, they completely dropped the ball by the end of this episode. I understand that they wanted to kind of do a meta-type ending, but then they completely lose me with all these iterations of "it was my plan all along," to the point where I can't even follow what the plot was supposed to be. Maybe that whole ending was supposed to be a joke, and in that case, it's not funny. If you want a good example of this, just look at Spy Buddies from SpongeBob. But in this episode, if they were really trying to play it off as an actual ending and seriously end the story that way, that's really disappointing, because it makes what was an interesting episode completely fall flat at the end when it didn't have to. It was kind of disappointing to see Remy's next appearance in the show just fizzle out into a confusing mess at the end. So, what do you get when one half is good and one half is bad? That's right, an okay episode. Episode 68A, Talkin Trash. Timmy calls up Wanda's father to clear the magic trash under his house. Here's something I never thought I'd see in the Fairly Oddparents. Although, I guess I shouldn't be surprised. Fairly Oddparents is such an adaptable show, they've satirized just about everything at this point. So to see a Godfather-type mob boss character in Wanda's father makes a little bit of sense. The only problem is, the only length they go in representing this character is through cliches I've already seen 1,000 times at this point. There's not a single joke with him in this episode that I didn't see coming from a mile away, which leaves only one possible joke for me to laugh at, which are the cuts back to Timmy's parents. By default, that has to be my favorite part, because the rest of this episode is stale and cliched. I do really think that the idea of the magic trash was a creative idea, but at the beginning of the episode you're not really sure what direction they're going to go with it. So I think there are some good ideas, but the execution of those ideas is off for sure. I could easily see how someone might like this episode, but for me, I expect a bit more from a new character than just being a cliche or stereotype. And because of that, I'm going to give this an okay. Maybe if they gave Wanda's dad a personality beyond stereotypical mob boss, I might have liked this episode. But when the entire episode revolves around a bland character, all the episode is destined to be is bland. Episode 68B, Timmy TV. Timmy finds out he's a reality TV star in Fairy World. This episode was one I was definitely worried about. I mean, it's about the television industry and brings to light some of the shadier practices involved in it. But actually, that's exactly why this episode works. Timmy wanting even more fame among the fairies, and so relinquishing control to this nasty TV executive, was a genius idea, and it is completely within character to sign a contract without reading it. The reality TV idea and having it go sour was a bit predictable, but I was expecting Timmy to eventually come close to losing Cosmo and Wanda. But I also think there's enough around it that I don't really mind. I really like the jokes in this episode. Cosmo's running gag about Timmy and words that don't apply to him, Cosmo thinking he has fans, Timmy's mom being switched for the mom from the Brady Bunch, and some others I can't think of off the top of my head had me at least chuckling for most of the episode. I think this episode can go toe-to-toe with some of the funniest of the whole series, and that really is what makes this episode. The jokes complement the plot in a way I don't think I've seen in this show so far. It's a good episode. The way the traditional reality show concepts blend with the distinct Fairly Oddparents style is a match made in heaven, and I haven't even mentioned the ending and how it ties the story together nicely. It's essentially a joke in its own right. Having Crocker get his own show in Fairy World is a nice addition to the episode that makes sense, and it concludes the episode nicely, and it's also funny. Overall, a nice addition to Season 5. Episode 69A, The Masked Magician, Timmy Becomes a Magician. I wonder how many times an episode of the Fairly Oddparents has had some decent jokes only for the story to be what drags it down. Usually it's the reverse that happens. But no, in this episode I thought it was pretty funny, but I found the story to be lackluster. This episode doesn't really know what it wants to do with its time, and it's only compounded by the fact that this episode acts as though it does know what it wants to do with its time. The whole Bickles thing seems like it was supposed to be the main conflict, but it doesn't take up the full focus of this episode. And the block party portion of the episode really didn't take up as much time as I would have liked either. I think Timmy becoming a magician that hides behind Cosmo and Wanda as a cover for his magic is definitely a decent idea, especially considering the fact that it's something I'm surprised we haven't seen on the show yet. But to me, we get this episode out of it, where it looked like they tried to do too many things at once. Maybe just a bit more focus could have made this episode better, but unfortunately it doesn't really seem like they knew what they wanted to do. A lot of times, crews will want to do an idea really badly, and so they stick so much onto it because they're really passionate about it. But what people don't realize is that you lose something when you do that, and in this case, it made for an okay episode. Episode 69B, The Big Bash. Timmy and Remy go on a scavenger hunt that's really just Cupid's grocery list. Fun fact, Cupid is apparently well known for his legendary parties, which is something I have to believe was pulled out of thin air just so this story could exist. But hey, I'm not complaining because I think it works. The structure of the scavenger hunt is a nice idea for an episode, especially on a grand scale. It's cool to see all the different locations the characters go to, especially because we haven't really had an adventure type episode in quite a while. The show is at its best when the stakes are high and there's a lot happening, and we get that in this episode. I also think the jokes here are decent as well. This wasn't a super funny episode or anything, but I think the jokes such as Cosmo betting Wanda for a nickel and some of the quick gags at the beginning were pretty funny. But the strength of the episode is the story. It kept me engaged and it didn't have any slow sections really. I also like the ending twist because it doesn't come out of nowhere, but it's also not completely obvious. Since this is an episode that's over a decade and a half old, I don't feel bad in spoiling it. Basically, Timmy and Remy were really getting the things on Cupid's grocery list, and I do think that is a decent twist. If I had one gripe with the episode, it would be that Remy and Timmy seemingly become friends out of nowhere at the end, and I have a feeling that it won't carry over into Remy's next appearance despite them never switching back. Admittedly, that is a small gripe though, and it didn't stop this episode from being good. Episode 70, Crash Nebula. Sprig Spivak tries to fit in a boarding school in outer space. I really wonder how I should judge this episode. Do I judge it as a pilot to a standalone show, or do I judge it as a Fairly Oddparents episode? In the end, I've decided to judge it as a Fairly Oddparents episode because there's no way I could justify not doing that, especially considering the fact that they made wraparound segments featuring Timmy, Cosmo, and Wanda. Although I feel like the rating wouldn't change either way. I want to say that the wraparound segments add charm to the episode, and technically they were my favorite part of the episode, but honestly, I think they only sour the episode the more I think about it. The wraparounds really only serve to hide the fact that this is a dropped pilot to a spin-off that never got picked up by Nickelodeon. And there's a reason this pilot never got picked up. It's a bad episode. First off, the episode has a major pacing problem that actually results in certain plot threads not even being resolved. The fact that the classroom even has a button that can eject the room's contents into outer space is already a stupid idea, but then when you stick Sprig out there trying to save the antimatter girl and only her and himself to talk to, the episode starts to drag. This portion of the episode lasts way too long and only serves to drag the story to a screeching halt. And then, as most cliché plots go where the main character gets the girl, you'd expect everything else to fall into place. Instead, Sprig getting the girl was really the only plot thread that got resolved. Sure, he gets to use the suit in the end, but I really don't consider that a plot thread. He's still an outcast, his sister is still a douche, and his classmates don't like him. Even though he gets the girl, it really feels unearned. She goes from hating him to liking him back almost instantaneously, with no transitional period between the two. But going back to the classmates, they really are poorly conceived. The jock character's superpower is super strength because this episode is the most cliched thing ever, but then, when Ani gets sucked into the vacuum of space, all of a sudden he turns into a complete wimp. One of the classmates' concepts is ripped straight from Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, and one of them is just a turkey with a mechanical body. But it's established early on that Sprig is the only student at this school from Earth, so then, where did this turkey come from? This whole plot was really poorly thought out, and I think I know why it never got made into a standalone show. But, shocker, when you turn it into a Fairly OddParents episode, not only is it lazy, but it doesn't magically make it any better. Episode 71A, Moving Day. Timmy's parents move away to a neighborhood that brainwashes its residents to be the exact same. When I first watched this episode, I really hated how the episode starts. In the beginning of this episode, Timmy seems really apathetic, like he doesn't care about his mom, and then it seems that neither does Mr. Turner. That sequence at the beginning where Wanda talks through their voices because they won't talk to Mrs. Turner is a really painful sequence to watch. It might just be the most awkward one of Season 5 so far. It's kind of a good thing this episode really gets a lot better once they get to Dimmadome Acres. You can kind of tell going in that something is really wrong about this place, but you don't know what. And as the episode goes, the conflict builds, and since Cosmo and Wanda are also brainwashed by the milk, this conflict is one that Timmy is going to have to solve by himself. That is commendable, because we really don't see it often. And aside from the beginning, the story is the biggest strength of this episode. I enjoyed seeing everyone's descent into uniformity, and the ending scene where Timmy uses the fizzy juice to contaminate the milk was a clever solution that was also foreshadowed. Overall, I think this is a good episode. The rest of the episode really is good enough to outweigh the beginning. Episode 71B, Big Wanda. Wanda's father gets kidnapped, leaving her to run the family business. So this episode is sort of a tangential part 2 to the episode Talkin Trash from earlier in the season. It's the second and final appearance of Wanda's father, Big Daddy, and the two episodes put together kind of form a mini arc if you want to call it that. Like with the first episode, there's a huge emphasis on referencing the Godfather, and that's where this episode draws its inspiration. It kind of has the same problems. I didn't find the jokes to be that funny. Someone other than me might find them funny, but I didn't. And I wish there was something else for me to gravitate to in this episode, but that's the whole thing. You might appreciate the Godfather references, and you might find Wanda's changes to the company to be amusing, but if you don't, like I do, then the episode is just going to be bland to you, and that's exactly what it is to me. This is an okay episode. I wasn't thrilled the first time they used this character, and I'm certainly not thrilled that they decided to use him again. I will admit it's nice that we're getting exposed to Wanda's family more this season, but so far it's given us 3 okay episodes. Maybe if they decided to give him more to do, or had substance to the episodes starring him, I wouldn't feel like his appearance was wasted. But instead, what we got were a few bland, underwhelming episodes. Episode 72A, Oh Brother. Timmy wishes for a big brother, but finds he's more pedantic than helpful. When you think about it, a lot of Fairly OddParents episodes follow a formula to some extent. You have Timmy recognizing a problem or envying people for some reason, then making a wish to try to solve that problem, only to realize it has unintended consequences. That right there summarizes a majority of episodes of this show, and that's not really a criticism as it's more of an observation about this show. Many of the good episodes tend to follow that formula, and this one's no different. This episode follows the formula I just described, and because of that, and a decent coupling of nice story and jokes, I really like this episode. I like the beginning portion of this episode in particular. Seeing Timmy's friends have brothers in some capacity makes the contrast a lot easier for the viewers to buy. I don't think this episode would have worked if there wasn't that kind of setup to Timmy wishing for an older brother, and overall, it makes the story work. Everything about this story works because of the setup, but that isn't everything about this episode I liked. I really like the jokes where Timmy's mom is getting seemingly older because she has an 18-year-old son, and some of the one-liners from Timmy's dad were also pretty nice. I also think the ending is another really good part of the episode. Tootie once again isn't like she has been in previous appearances where she seems to be a creep, but she is essentially a pawn in Timmy's plot resolution. He has to bite the bullet and get her to love him again so he can wish Tommy out of existence, and I think that's not only clever, but a nice way of making things go back to the status quo without being contrived. So overall, this is one of the better episodes this season. Episode 72B, What's the Difference? Timmy turns the entire school into a Find It puzzle book. This is a really zany episode, and that's not something I've been able to say about a Fairly OddParents episode in a while, but it's true here. The hectic nature of this episode makes it so it's not much of a start-to-finish plot, but one where new threads open and close seemingly at random times. That might sound like a criticism, but it really isn't. In this episode, there are a few conflicts going on at the same time that are all kind of intertwined. Chief among them, Mandai trying to essentially kidnap Mark, but then after that, once Timmy turns the whole school into a Find It, finding Cosmo and Wanda's wands is the main concern. Because they managed to balance all of that while still keeping the episode engaging and funny, that's quite a feat. and it's one that I don't think I've seen done in this show to this point. But aside from the really engaging story, the jokes are also present as well. Seeing some of the things ordinary objects have turned into created some comedic moments, like when Mandai's gun turned into a hot dog. But the real comedy, and the ultimate reason this is a good episode, is Crocker. His obliviousness isn't the frustrating kind of obliviousness, like it often is with Cosmo. Instead, Crocker is blissfully unaware of the fact that magic is going on right under his nose, and we get a few moments where he has a wand and doesn't know he's turning his head into different objects. I also like the joke with Crocker not knowing the very obvious crossword clues in his puzzle. Like I said, I really like this episode, but the jokes with Crocker were what tied it together for me. Episode 73A, Smart Attack. Mr. Turner becomes a genius. Everyone knows what I'm about to say. This episode is a ripoff of Smarty Pants from Season 2. However, that doesn't necessarily mean I dislike the episode. If this show wants to reuse concepts and do them better the second time, then I have no problem with them reusing the concepts. Thankfully, that's what was done here. The stupid dad trope is one that needs to die. I'm not the first one to say this, but this episode actually uses one of my least favorite tropes in cartoons as a strength, and it's what makes the episode work. Allow me to explain. Timmy in this episode needs help with a subject he doesn't like, and upon seeing his dad's ineptitude, wishes for his dad to be smart. Timmy's parents in this season have essentially been reduced to jokes, and they rarely do anything that has any bearing on the story. But in this episode, Timmy's dad is actually the driving force behind the story, and the episode is better because of it. The jokes that set up the wish are also really funny, as the only person that gets hurt from Mr. Turner's stupidity is himself. I think if they had structured it where Timmy was getting hurt from his dad's antics, this episode would not have worked. Especially because later on, Timmy's smart dad almost outs Cosmo and Wanda. But the ending to this episode ties it together emotionally, so it works. Now, the ending isn't perfect. The way Timmy's dad just goes along with him did seem a bit like a cop-out ending, but I don't mind it because I think it was set up just fine. The progression of Timmy's dad making his life more and more difficult is paced perfectly, and I think Cosmo and Wanda being threatened is the kind of conflict the episode needed, and it comes up at just the right time in the episode. The episode is a bit light on jokes, but there are enough in the beginning to pull this up to being a good episode. Episode 73B, Operation F.U.N. Timmy goes to a military school as part of Remy's plan to get rid of Cosmo and Wanda. That title seems very suspect. But aside from that, the episode that comes with it might be everything you expect from Fairly OddParents Season 5. And what I mean by that is that we've seen a lot more continuity this season. There are episodes directly tied to previous ones from the season, and I'm all for it. I think it gives the show another layer of depth, and I think depth was one of the things lacking in Season 4, even though I thought it was good. The truant officer returns in this episode once again, and I think he was a good source of jokes in this episode, along with Cosmo. Remy also makes his third appearance in this season, and I do like that they treat the Remy episodes as sort of an arc, where one leads into the next. The truce from Remy's last appearance is even acknowledged here, which I did not expect to happen. I think the story is kind of meandering with no clear direction it wants to go, but honestly I don't really mind, because I think the episode doesn't really have to stand alone, and is more a continuation of the other Remy episodes. As such, I think it makes more sense to judge this episode in the context of the other ones. Some of you might say it's not fair to do that, but I think the continuity is a real strength in this episode, in a way it really isn't for the Mark or the Big Daddy episodes. And while there aren't a ton of jokes, I think there are enough small funny moments that I can consider this a light, good episode. Episode 74A, Something's Fishy. Timmy visits Atlantis only to find that Cosmo is a wanted criminal. Fun fact, this episode takes a dig at SpongeBob, which kinda caught me off guard, but if they were to do it in any episode, it's probably most appropriate in the underwater episode. It happens when the leader of Atlantis talks about the Atlantean diet, and he mentions an underwater squirrel and coughs one up. Fun fact aside, the one big note I have for this episode is that it is one of the most creative ones of the whole show. To have Timmy go underwater is one thing, and that kind of thing is common on a lot of other shows. But to have Timmy go underwater and find that Cosmo has sunk in Atlantis 9 times is quite clever. I especially like seeing his interactions with the underwater creatures and how afraid they are of him, as he has essentially destroyed their civilization multiple times. The episode isn't super packed with jokes, but I do think there are enough to satisfy what I wanted to see in a Fairly OddParents episode. And overall, I liked the story up until the last 30 seconds or so. In that time, the resolved conflicts completely unravels, and we're back to where we started, just with Timmy instead of Cosmo. And then they just get in a car with 2 fish we've never seen before, and the episode just ends right there. Really with no closure on anything. Yeah, that was annoying, but it didn't last that long, and it wasn't enough to prevent this episode from being a good episode. 74B, Presto Change-o, Timmy swaps bodies with Crocker. Body swap plots are ones that can have very good return on investment, but they can also go wrong very easily. And in a show that's done this type of plot before, getting a bad rating, I don't blame them for trying again. This time it was really good. What makes this episode to me is the small moments of observational humor made by Crocker in the latter portion of the episode. Stuff like giving himself an F on his homework and getting aggravated at Timmy's parents. And along with that, we have a sequence at the end that's just great. Timmy trying to get Crocker ends up swapping bodies with practically the whole cast, and a lot of good jokes result from that scene. I think the story is a bit all over the place, but the jokes make up for it, and we get to discover character dynamics in a new way, which should be appreciated. Some of the weaker portions of the episode are when they are cut back to Cosmo and Wanda, when I don't really care what's going on and I don't find it to be very funny. And that's probably because Mama Cosmo being sick is the same joke over and over, and they don't vary that to any degree. Sure, Wanda trying to milk the moment for all it's worth is kind of amusing, but I found myself caring a lot more about the Timmy portions of the episode, because those were a lot better in my opinion. Despite my negative opinion on the cuts back to Cosmo and Wanda, I don't think they took too much away from this episode, though. Episode 75A, The Good Old Days. Timmy travels into the old cartoons his pappy showed him. As a kid, this episode was one of my favorites, and going in, I knew this was going to be one of my favorites in this season. As a matter of fact, I remember this episode being in Season 6 or 7, but actually, no, instead it's in Season 5, which came as a surprise to me, and I think it's due to how upscaled the animation seems to me. They went all out on putting these characters in a vintage atmosphere, and that's the episode's greatest strength, because it elevates the story and jokes along with it. The jokes here reference old cartoons and the tropes within, such as pianos falling on people, and in general, the episode heavily satirizes Popeye the Sailor Man, which I do appreciate. I also like the vintage-style rendition of the Icky Vicky song. That was something I thought was pretty cool. This is one of the more detail-oriented episodes of the entire show, and it really does feel like there was a lot more care put into this episode to make it a quality product. It's almost as if this episode is a spiritual successor to Channel Chasers, and considering the success that was Channel Chasers, I don't blame them for milking that same cow again. I also really like the setup. At first, Timmy feels like he's exhausted all his options to find something in common he has with Pappy, but when things look the most bleak, he shows Timmy cartoons from back in his day, which is actually a well-thought way to set up this story. And combining that with the jokes and references to old cartoons, I see this as a good episode, and not only as a good Fairly Oddparents episode, but as an homage to the inspirations that allowed shows like the Fairly Oddparents to exist in the first place. Episode 75B, Future Lost. Timmy wishes himself into a version of the future from a book in his attic. So this episode pairing seems very much intentional. In the A episode, Timmy travels into a fictional version of the past. In this B episode, Timmy travels into a fictional version of the future. But that isn't the only thing that's opposite about this episode pairing. The A episode was good, while this was a bad episode. Let's start with the beginning of the episode. When Timmy finds this book and only reads the first chapter, Wanda discourages Timmy's wish. Automatically, this means we know the book has something unforeseen that makes the future not look as good. And as such, this is one of the worst examples of foreshadowing I've ever seen. This is the Fairly Oddparents. Of course this wish is going to have unforeseen consequences. That doesn't mean anything with regards to the details of it. There are some things you can leave to the viewers. We know there's going to be a conflict at some point in the episode. That doesn't mean the episode has to hold our hands until we get to that point. And as for the way the story ends, it really doesn't make any sense. Timmy takes some of the juice tablets and puts them in the tank this brain is floating in, but it was never shown that these pills could make the liquid they're suspended in freeze over. Sure, Timmy gets a brain freeze at the beginning of the episode, but he was drinking a slushie, and that's not the same thing as a juice pill dissolved in water. And pills dissolving in water don't make the water freeze over. In fact, solubility increases with temperature. So really, the pill would dissolve easier if the water was warmer. I know that might be a nitpick to bring that up, but no it isn't. That's how the conflict is resolved. And unfortunately, there are practically zero jokes to pick up this messed up story. The parts that weren't completely stupid were plot points you could see coming from a mile away. What a disappointing episode. Episode 76, When Nerds Collide. The Anti-Fairies escape prison and stop Earth's rotation so Friday the 13th remains perpetually. So here we have the episode I probably watched more than any other growing up. As a child, the only DVD of this show that I had was this episode, and so I was really eager to see if it held up as well as I remembered it, even more than the other two Jimmy Timmy crossovers. Well, I'm disappointed to say that no it doesn't. Some people were surprised to see that I gave the first crossover an okay, but honestly, this one has a lot of the same problems. This episode does fix my main complaint from the first one, and I do have to give credit there. Unfortunately, they failed to make the pacing such that this episode didn't seem like two different episodes. The plot doesn't progress in a natural way. The first 20 minutes or so is just complete filler, and could have been cut out of the episode almost completely, or at the very least trimmed down. Then the second act goes by way too fast, and the conflict with the anti-fairies gets solved way too quickly. And I guess by that point the writers found out that, oh no, we still have 15 minutes left in the episode, and just pulled the second conflict out of thin air. And that last 15 minutes drags. It is some of the most boring material I've ever had to sit through in this every episode reviewed series. We're just sitting back, waiting to defuse this bomb, and basically watching all the characters screw around. It's a conflict that didn't need to be in the episode, and I think the anti-fairy conflict should have been lengthened instead. Because of course the best portion of the episode lasts the shortest amount of time. That makes perfect sense! So because there were parts of the episode I liked, such as the anti-fairies and a select few jokes, I'm gonna give this episode an okay. Episode 77A, Timmy the Barbarian. Jorgen narrates the story of Timmy the Barbarian. If there's one thing I've never revealed on this channel, it's that I'm a huge sucker for frame stories. And this one really delivers in that regard. Jorgen trying to fumble through the story is, in and of itself, really funny, especially when considering the fact that we know Jorgen doesn't like Cosmo. So seeing him make bad things happen to him on purpose, while cruel, is still funny to me. I also like Timmy nonchalantly reacting to Jorgen's narration, as it's clear he resents the whole situation, but he's still playing along. As the stories go, this one is rather weak, but at the same time, ironically, that isn't really the function here. As a matter of fact, the worse the story is, the funnier it is, because the whole joke is how bad Jorgen is at telling stories, and that allows the rest of the jokes to shine through. Since this is fictional in-universe, we see Crocker actually interact with Cosmo and Wanda, which actually produces a funny moment, where Crocker is taken aback by Wanda's nagging. Overall, I really enjoy the creativity, and I do think it's a good episode. The plot may not make much sense here, but that's exactly why the episode works, and how they managed to make an episode that way is admirable. Episode 77B, No Substitute for Crazy. A fairy hunter subs for Mr. Crocker. I could see this episode being bad from a mile away, and it's very disappointing. Here they had an opportunity to develop Crocker's character and make him more likable. Instead, we get an episode where his flaws are pushed to the side because, hey, at least he's not Doombringer. Just because you have a worse character introduced in the same episode, that doesn't make the original character of Crocker any better. Right after this episode, Crocker's going to go right back to enjoying the pain and suffering of children, and this is treated as okay by the episode because he's good by comparison. It might seem like a nitpick to point that out, but that's the main point of the episode. And as a matter of fact, Crocker saves the day in the end. But don't let that fool you. The episode ends with Doombringer getting hit by a bus and saying she'll be back, and then she never appears in the show after that. And for this being her only appearance in the show, that's pretty sad. I could understand not remembering this character, but up to this point the show has actually had pretty good continuity, so there's really no excuse. But maybe having Doombringer not return is actually a good thing, since she's a badly written character. When you have a character whose only purpose is to be a comparison to another character, that's not right. You could do that for maybe a quick gag or two, but to have them serve majorly in the plot of an episode, you're gonna run into bad implications if you're not careful, and that's exactly what happened here. Episode 78, The Jerkinators. Jimmy and Timmy create their own villain for the express purpose of being challenging to beat. Alright, back to the third Jimmy-Timmy crossover. You know, the first two getting okays was kinda disappointing to me. I remembered them more fondly, and it's disappointing to revisit them and realize they weren't all that great. But what about this one? Well, I actually think for once they managed to tell one complete story all the way through for the first time in this trilogy. I think the story is action-packed and the stakes feel higher than the last one, despite being scaled a bit smaller, because this villain is actually tough to beat by design. In the second one, because they decide to have two conflicts, they're really not given enough time and they're solved with too much ease. This time, setting up and defeating Shirley takes up the full runtime and it doesn't feel like any time is wasted. I really do enjoy the character of Shirley as well. It's really funny in the beginning when they realize they forgot to make him evil and he does stuff like getting Jimmy's shoes dirty. So to have them realize their mistake and try to make them angry also helps this episode because the conflict is Timmy and Jimmy's fault, which serves them right for ignoring their friends. Most of the jokes in the beginning revolve around Shirley not knowing how to be a villain, and as the episode goes on there are less and less jokes, but I don't really mind it because it allows the focus to be placed on the story, and the episode is still funny enough. And so, that means this is the first good episode in the trilogy, and obviously, that means that I think this is the best episode in the trilogy. Episode 79 and 80, Fairy Idol. Norm forces a clone to make Cosmo and Wanda quit being Timmy's fairies. Every season since season 3 has had at least one TV movie, and if you don't count the Jimmy Timmy Power Hours, that's true for this one as well. I think at some point I've lost my appreciation for just how good of a track record this show has had. So far, besides the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour trilogy, there have been no okay or bad TV movies so far. For a show that typically has only 11-minute episodes, that's not an easy feat. For this one, I find it kind of puzzling that the Fairy Idol portion of the episode doesn't take up that much of the episode by percentage. But considering how pretty much it's one giant joke, I'm not too upset by that. I'm a sucker for Norm episodes anyway, and this is one of his best appearances. Norm seems like a great character to give a TV movie to because he's a character that can really elevate the stakes while also providing jokes. Surprisingly, Norm is actually really serious in this episode though. There aren't many jokes with him, but that doesn't mean this episode is jokeless either. I like the joke where Binky plays the wrong track over Jorgen's speech, and I also like jokes like the apology cookie running gag, and Jorgen being surprised and saying he's not responsible for turning Cosmo and Wanda into dust. I also like the heartwarming moments with Timmy. They do a good job at capitalizing on the emotion of the story, which I think is the biggest strength of the episode. We see Timmy really does care about Cosmo and Wanda, and it's a heartwarming moment we don't see in this show very often. As for the musical number, my biggest complaint is that there aren't more of them. Not that the one we get isn't good, but I wish there were more. In an episode parodying American Idol, you'd think there'd be more songs from the episode, but no, they're used pretty sparingly. Overall, that doesn't stop this from being a good episode, though. And that, my friends, is every episode of the Fairly Oddparents Season 5 reviewed. I want to get into the rating first before I do anything else. Season 5 is a good season. And I don't think that's too much of a surprise if you listen to my tone of voice throughout most of these reviews. I was really impressed with these, a lot more than Season 4, even though Season 4 was also a good season. And you know what? I'm gonna say it, this is the best one so far. Looking at the pie chart, it's really no surprise that Season 5 has far and away the best pie chart so far, and I think that makes sense. Season 5 has way more bads than Season 1, but I think the Season 1 statistics are a bit skewed by having so few episodes. If they decided to add more episodes to Season 1, it might have more bad episodes as well. And out of 36, 6 bads is not too bad. And now we can talk about this being the only season that I have notes for. And I have a few notes that I wanted to talk about with this season because I noticed some common threads. The first one is that there's more continuity, which I'm fine with, I'm okay with it, and I'm okay without it for the Fairly Oddparents, but it's nice that we get more continuity with this season in particular. It makes the show feel more cohesive and like one threaded universe instead of an episodic universe like a lot of other cartoons at the time. We get to see a lot of Wanda's family in this season, and the 3 episodes that have a heavy focus on introducing Wanda's family, they all got okays. So I'm in favor of not bringing those characters back, as it seems that they create bland episodes. Mark Chang appears 5 times in this season, which is more than in any other, and while I do like the character, it's kind of interesting that they picked this season to use him a lot, and then don't really use him a lot for the rest of the series. Just an interesting point, I don't really think it affects the quality of the season. As usual, by the time that this has come out, I feel like I need more time to pick my 5 best and worst, so that's going to be its own video later on. But, as always, thanks for watching, thanks to Pie Guy Rules for the inspiration, and thanks to the Fairly Oddparents Wiki for the information, and everyone, have a good one.